Scout had found something under the mountain, but the fresh bootprints above them meant someone else was already looking for it. Jack killed his headlamp. Scout's growl vibrated through the black chamber as a boot scraped stone overhead. Jack held the dog's collar, barely breathing. Then the footsteps stopped. Whoever stood above them knew exactly where to look. But how? What do you think was waiting outside? The hiss came before Jack Mercer was fully awake. Air brakes released somewhere beyond the rain-streaked windshield with a violent rush, followed by the deep growl of a diesel engine. Jack came upright so fast his shoulder struck the steering wheel. His right hand disappeared beneath his jacket. For half a second, there was no Washington. There was dust, heat, a road outside Kandahar, a stopped convoy, and somebody yelling over the radio. Then a cold nose touched his wrist. Jack froze. Rain ticked against the roof of the old pickup. White parking lines shone beneath the lamps of the highway rest area east of Spokane. A vending machine hummed beside the restroom building. Beyond the windshield, a trucker climbed into his cab carrying a paper cup. Jack slowly pulled his empty hand from beneath his jacket. "Yeah," he whispered. "I know." Scout watched him from between the seats. The 5-year-old German Shepherd had a dark sable coat, broad chest, and the patient amber eyes of an animal that had learned more about one man than most people ever had. He hadn't barked. He almost never did when Jack woke like this. He simply waited. Wrong road. Scout pushed his muzzle against Jack's palm. Jack rubbed the dog's head until the shaking in his fingers stopped. It was 4:47 in the morning. He had slept for maybe 2 hours. That made it a decent night. Jack pushed open the driver's door. Cold rain blew under his collar immediately. At 43, he still carried some of the shape the Army had built into him, though 8 months of sleeping in a truck had carved away much of the rest. His beard had gone uneven and gray along the jaw. An old knee injury made the first few steps stiff. Scout jumped down behind him and stretched. Jack automatically looked across the parking lot. 3 semis, 2 passenger cars, a camper near the trees, 1 entrance, 1 exit. Nobody paying attention to him. He hated that he still counted. He hated even more that counting made him feel better. "Clear enough," he muttered. Scout trotted toward the wet grass. The pickup behind them was a faded 2006 Ford F-150 with rust over the wheel wells and a camper shell Jack had bought used. Everything he still owned fit inside it. 2 duffel bags, a sleeping bag, work boots, a toolbox, a camp stove, several Army photographs he rarely looked at, and Scout's food. The truck had become a bedroom, kitchen, storage shed, and a dress that couldn't receive mail. Home was too generous a word. Jack opened the tailgate and pulled out a dented metal pot. Breakfast was the last of yesterday's oatmeal mixed with half a bruised apple. Scout had kibble. Not much. Jack poured the remaining food into the dog's bowl, then stopped. Too much. He scooped some back into the bag. Tomorrow's problem. Scout sat beside the bowl. Jack leaned against the tailgate and ate 2 spoonfuls of oatmeal. Scout continued watching him. "Eat." "Nothing." Jack sighed. "You know, for somebody who eats things he finds under picnic tables, you've got a strange sense of principle." Scout's ears lifted. Jack took another spoonful and swallowed. Only then did Scout lower his head and begin eating. Jack looked away. There were mornings when that small ritual bothered him more than the nightmares. Scout had learned it during the worst stretch, when Jack would feed him and claim he wasn't hungry. Somehow the dog had figured out the pattern. Now he waited until Jack ate before touching his own food, as if meals were something they survived together. 8 months earlier, Jack had still rented a room outside Coeur d'Alene and repaired logging equipment for a small contractor. Then the company lost 2 major contracts. Temporary layoffs became permanent ones. Jack had savings, until the transmission failed. Then the medical bills came. Then the landlord stopped accepting promises. None of it happened dramatically. There had been no single day when Jack Mercer lost his life. It disappeared $20 at a time. He had tried construction crews, warehouse work, overnight maintenance. Some lasted weeks. Others ended after employers discovered he sometimes needed to step outside when machinery made certain sounds. The worst had been a steel plate dropped behind him at a fabrication shop. Jack remembered being on the floor before he understood he'd moved. Everybody staring, one younger worker laughing because he thought Jack was joking. Jack hadn't returned after lunch. Scout finished eating and nudged the empty bowl toward him. "That's it." The dog inspected it again, apparently unconvinced. Jack almost smiled. Almost. By 7, they were back on Interstate 90. The heater worked only on its highest setting, blasting air hot enough to dry Jack's eyes. Scout sat upright in the passenger seat, watching pine-covered hills slide past beneath low clouds. Jack kept the radio off. He preferred engines he could identify. The Veterans Outreach Center occupied an old brick building on the edge of Spokane. Jack had avoided it for months. Other veterans needed the resources more, he'd told himself. Men with missing legs, men with families, men who couldn't work. It had taken a counselor named Tom Alvarez 3 conversations to convince him that sleeping in a truck qualified as needing help. Jack parked near the back. Scout remained beside him. "You stay." Scout stared at him. "Don't start." Scout tilted his head. Jack opened the passenger door. "Fine." Inside, the building smelled of coffee, wet coats, and industrial cleaner. A television played quietly in the waiting room. Jack chose a chair against the wall where he could see both exits. Scout settled beneath his knees. Tom Alvarez appeared carrying 2 coffees. "Mercer." "Alvarez." Tom handed him one. Jack took it suspiciously. "What's this going to cost?" 3 hours of paperwork and your immortal soul." "Keep the coffee." Tom laughed and sat across from him. They went through job listings first. Building maintenance, equipment repair, county road crews. Jack dismissed anything requiring an address he couldn't provide. Tom stopped him. "We can use this office for correspondence. I don't need special treatment. It's an address, Jack, not a parade." Jack stared into the coffee. Scout's chin rested on his boot. Then the receptionist called from across the room. "Jack Mercer?" Jack looked up. She was holding an envelope. "Something came for you," Jack frowned. "Here? Certified." Tom glanced at him. "You give anyone this address?" "No." The receptionist walked over. The envelope was thick cream paper, too formal for a bill. Jack's full name was typed across the front. Jack Daniel Mercer. Below it was the Outreach Center's address. The return address was in Wyoming. Price and Wells Estate, Lawlander, Wyoming. Jack turned the envelope over. Still sealed. Scout stood. For reasons Jack couldn't explain, the dog sniffed the bottom edge, then looked up at him. Tom nodded toward it. "You planning to open that?" Jack slid one finger beneath the flap. 8 months without a home. Almost a year without anything arriving that wasn't asking him for money he didn't have. And now someone in Wyoming had somehow found him. Inside was a letter, several legal forms, and the photocopy of an old photograph. Jack saw the photograph first. 2 men stood beside a log cabin beneath a wall of mountains. One was Jack's grandfather. The other face took longer. Older even in the picture. Lean. Serious. Familiar in the vague way people from childhood sometimes were. Jack turned to the letter. The first line made him stop breathing for a moment. "Dear Mr. Mercer, we regret to inform you of the death of your great-uncle, Silas Mercer." Scout leaned against his leg. Jack read the next sentence. Then he read it again. Silas Mercer had left him property, a cabin, approximately 60 acres, in the mountains of Wyoming. Jack stared at the page while rain traced crooked paths down the window behind him. Tom said something, but Jack didn't hear it. His eyes had reached the final paragraph. The property had no mortgage, no lien, no co-owner. It belonged to Jack if he chose to accept it. A man who hadn't possessed an address in 8 months had just been given 60 acres and a cabin by someone he barely remembered. Jack lowered the letter. Scout was still watching him. For the first time that morning, Jack had no idea what came next. Tom Alvarez read the letter twice before setting it carefully on the table. 60 acres, approximately, and a cabin. That's what it says. Tom looked across the table. You understand, most people would be smiling right now. Jack folded the photograph back into the envelope. Most people haven't been surprised enough times to know better. Scout rested beneath the table, one paw touching Jack's boot. The letter contained a telephone number for Evelyn Price, the attorney handling Silas Mercer's estate. Jack borrowed an empty office and called before he could talk himself out of it. A woman answered on the third ring. Price and Wells. My name is Jack Mercer. There was a brief silence. Then her voice softened. Mr. Mercer, I've been hoping you'd call. Evelyn Price sounded older, precise without being cold. She confirmed every detail. Silas had died quietly 6 weeks earlier at 86. He had no children, no surviving spouse, and had specifically named Jack as beneficiary of the Wyoming property. Why me? That question is probably better answered by Silas. He's dead. Silas anticipated that difficulty. Jack almost smiled. Almost. Evelyn explained that several boxes of Silas's personal papers remained at the cabin. Beyond that, she knew only what her client had chosen to tell her. The property lay west of Dubois, near the Wind River country. 61 acres according to the current county description. The cabin had no conventional power connection. Water came from a spring-fed system. Winter access could become difficult or impossible after heavy snow. What's it worth? Evelyn hesitated. That's complicated. Usually means not much. The structure hasn't been formally appraised in years. The land is steep, remote, and not especially attractive for conventional development. Jack stared through the office window at Scout sitting beside the chair. So I inherited something nobody wants. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. There was, however, no mortgage. Silas had kept the taxes current and left a small account to cover estate expenses and Jack's travel to Wyoming. Not wealth. Enough gasoline to reach a cabin everyone else might consider useless. When Jack ended the call, he sat for a long time without moving. Tom appeared in the doorway. Well, it's real. Congratulations. Don't. Don't what? Turn it into some miracle. Tom studied him. Jack looked toward the parking lot, where rain had finally begun to thin. It's a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Tom shrugged. You've been sleeping in a Ford in the middle of everywhere. That landed harder than Jack wanted it to. By afternoon, Jack had driven to a diner near the interstate and ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. Scout lay beneath the table while Jack stared at his phone. There were 2 people he hadn't wanted to call. He called them anyway. Grant Mercer answered first. Jack's older brother had always possessed the kind of confidence Jack associated with men who had never been forced to question whether they belonged somewhere. Grant managed commercial construction projects around Seattle, owned a large house, and spoke about money as though financial trouble were a personality defect. Jack? Yeah. What's wrong? Nothing about hello, nothing about how are you. Jack looked out the window. Silas died. Silas who? Great Uncle Silas. A pause. The mountain guy? He left me his property in Wyoming. Grant laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because it was Jack. What property? Cabin. 60 acres. Where? Outside Dubois. Grant laughed again. Jesus, Jack. That's probably rocks and pine trees. Probably. Does it even have utilities? Some solar, spring water. That's not utilities. Jack's jaw tightened. Grant continued. Listen, don't get sentimental because some old hermit left you a shack. You need cash, not another project. I didn't ask for advice, you called me. Jack said nothing. Grant filled the silence. You couldn't keep the place in Idaho. You lost the maintenance job. Now you're going to manage mountain property? Jack's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. Scout raised his head. Grant wasn't entirely wrong. That was what made it hurt. I lost the job because the company folded. And the house? It was a rented room. Exactly. Jack stared at the steam rising from his coffee. Grant's voice softened, but somehow that made it worse. Look, you've had a rough run since you came back. Nobody's denying that. But maybe stop trying to prove you can handle everything alone. Jack's eyes moved to Scout. The dog had risen now. One paw settled quietly across Jack's boot. Jack breathed out through his nose. I'm not proving anything. Then sell it. Maybe. Call Dana. She'll know what to do. Grant hung up before Jack could answer. Jack sat there listening to the empty line. For a moment, the diner disappeared beneath another sound. Metal striking metal. A blast door in Afghanistan slamming somewhere behind him. A sergeant shouting his name. Jack blinked. Coffee. Window. Rain. Scout. He lowered his hand beneath the table and touched the dog's neck. Still here. Scout leaned harder against his leg. Dana Mercer called 20 minutes later. Grant had apparently beaten him to it. Dana was Jack's cousin and had spent 15 years selling rural properties across eastern Washington. She was efficient, cheerful, and capable of making an insult sound like professional guidance. I pulled the area up already, she said. You work fast. Grant said you might do something impulsive. Jack closed his eyes. Dana continued. That country can be gorgeous, but remote acreage is hard. No year-round maintained road kills value. No grid power hurts financing. If the cabin needs structural work, you're looking at more money than it's worth. You haven't seen it. I don't need to see every broken cabin in America to know what one costs. Scout's ears turned toward Jack's voice. What are you suggesting? Let me handle it. You can assign me authority. I'll get someone out there. And if there's any value at all, I'll find a buyer. And your commission? Dana laughed lightly. Jack, I'm trying to help you. That sentence carried history. After their father died, Jack had been recovering from knee surgery and barely holding down contract work. Grant had offered to manage the estate paperwork. Dana had helped with property expenses. Jack had trusted both of them. His portion had gradually disappeared into fees, reimbursements, repairs, and obligations he hadn't understood until it was too late. Every explanation had sounded reasonable individually. Together, they had left him with almost nothing. I'll see the cabin first. Dana sighed. You're sleeping in your truck, Jack. He went still. Grant had told her. So? So maybe this isn't the time for pride. Something cold moved through him. Pride isn't why I'm going. Then why? Jack looked down. Scout was still touching his boot. Because Scout deserved ground that didn't belong to a rest stop. Because Jack wanted one door he could close without wondering when someone would tell him to move along. Because somewhere in Wyoming stood a cabin that belonged to him before he'd even seen it. He didn't tell Dana any of that. "I'll call you if I decide to sell. Jack." He ended the call. Outside, the rain had stopped. Jack drove back to the outreach center before closing. Evelyn had emailed the acceptance documents. He sat at the same table where he'd opened Silas's letter. The signature line waited at the bottom. Jack Mercer. Scout rested beside him. Jack picked up the pen. His hand paused. For 8 months, nearly every decision he'd made had been about getting through one more night. Where to park, how much gasoline to buy, whether he could afford dinner, whether a job application was worth the drive. This decision felt different. Maybe Grant was right. Maybe the roof leaked. Maybe the spring had dried up. Maybe Silas had left him 60 acres of granite, dead timber, and bills. Jack looked at Scout. "You want to see Wyoming?" Scout's tail struck the floor once. Jack signed. 2 days later, he loaded the truck with fuel cans, canned food, cold weather gear, his tools, Scout's kibble, and everything else they owned. The road east waited beneath a pale October sky. Jack folded Silas's photograph and placed it inside the glove compartment. Then he noticed something he'd missed before. In the old picture, Silas wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking past it, toward the granite ridge behind the cabin. Jack studied the image another moment before closing the compartment. Probably nothing. Scout climbed into the passenger seat. Jack started the engine. Neither of them knew yet that the 60 acres on Silas Mercer's paperwork were only the smallest part of what was waiting in those mountains. They left Spokane before sunrise. By the time eastern Washington flattened into open country, the clouds had broken apart, leaving strips of pale blue above fields silvered with frost. Jack drove with both hands loose on the wheel. Scout sat beside him, nose occasionally touching the cracked window whenever some new smell crossed the highway. Everything they owned traveled behind them. 2 duffel bags, tools, sleeping gear, food, water, Jack's old field kit, Scout's blanket. It should have felt frightening. Instead, with every mile behind them, Jack felt something inside him loosen. Nobody could tell him to leave a rest area if he wasn't there anymore. They crossed Idaho, then turned south and east toward Wyoming. Gasoline consumed the small travel allowance faster than Jack liked. He kept every receipt in the center console and calculated the remaining money at each stop. Scout received no such financial briefing. He considered every stop an opportunity. At a lonely gas station, the dog discovered a patch of snow beside the building and shoved his entire muzzle into it. Jack watched him emerge covered in white. "You look ridiculous." Scout sneezed. For the first time in days, Jack laughed. The sound surprised him. It was short and rusty, as though it hadn't been used enough. By the following afternoon, the country had changed completely. The mountains no longer waited on the horizon. They surrounded the road. Jagged ridges rose above forests of lodgepole pine and spruce. Wind pushed dry grass in waves across broad valleys. The sky seemed too large to belong to the same country as Spokane. Past Dubois, Jack stopped for fuel and showed Silas's directions to an elderly clerk. The man studied them. "You're going up Mercer Ridge?" "That's what it says." The clerk looked outside at Jack's truck. "You got chains?" "Yeah." "Winch?" "No." The man handed the paper back. "Then don't get ambitious." Jack understood exactly what he meant. The paved road ended 12 miles later. Gravel followed. Then washboard. Then something that barely deserved to be called a road. The truck climbed between dark pines, tires bouncing through ruts hardened by years of runoff. Jack drove slowly, reading the ground ahead instead of staring immediately in front of the hood. Water moved downhill. Loose soil followed water. Dark patches meant moisture. Bent vegetation meant somebody had passed recently. Old habits, useful habits. He didn't mind those. By late afternoon, rain began tapping the windshield. Then it came harder. Jack rounded a bend and stopped. The road ahead crossed a steep drainage where mud had washed down from the slope. Brown water ran across the track. Jack got out. Scout followed. Stay close. Jack walked the crossing first. The surface looked solid. His boots sank 4 inches. He crouched and picked up a handful of soil. Saturated. The downhill edge had already started slumping. He looked at the fading sky, then at the truck. Another mile, maybe 2, according to Silas's directions. He could turn around, except the nearest place to sleep was miles behind them. Jack put on the tire chains. The first 20 feet went fine. Then the right rear wheel dropped. The truck lurched sideways. Jack immediately stopped accelerating. That's enough. He climbed out into cold rain. The rear axle was buried almost to the differential. Scout stood under a pine tree watching him. Jack examined the slope. Trying to power through would dig them deeper. Worse, the downhill side of the road was soft enough that another foot of sideways movement could put the truck into the drainage. He'd seen vehicles lost because somebody refused to accept the first bad decision. Truck stays. Scout shook rain from his coat. Jack pulled his pack from behind the seat. Sleeping bag. Water. Food. First aid kit. Flashlight. Hatchet. Extra socks. Map. He looked at the toolbox and reluctantly left most of it behind. Mobility over comfort. The words came automatically. Scout's ears lifted. Jack stopped. A memory flashed. Young soldiers unloading equipment beside armored vehicles. Somebody complaining about leaving unnecessary gear behind. Jack closed his eyes. Rain touched his face. Wyoming, not Afghanistan. He opened them again. Come on. They continued on foot. The road narrowed through the forest. Rain softened to mist, and their footsteps became the loudest sound in the world. Jack's knee began aching after half a mile. He ignored it. Scout moved 20 feet ahead, then returned, repeatedly checking him. I'm fine. Scout didn't believe him. The forest opened onto a high meadow. Then 3 rifle shots cracked across the valley. Jack was moving before thought caught up. He dropped behind a fallen trunk, shoulder against wet bark, eyes scanning the opposite ridge. Distance, direction, possible firing point. Scout came back immediately. Jack raised one hand. Down. The dog crouched. Another shot echoed. Jack's breathing shortened. For a heartbeat, the meadow became a different landscape. Brown mountains. A radio pressed against his ear. Someone shouting, "Contact left!" His fingers dug into the bark. Then came laughter. Far away. Human laughter. Jack focused. Across the valley, 2 orange shapes moved between trees. Hunters. One raised an arm. A moment later came another distant shot. Jack remained behind the log. Scout crawled closer and pushed his nose beneath Jack's chin. Warm breath. Wet fur. Jack blinked. The Afghan mountains disappeared. He looked at the dog. Wrong country, buddy. Scout licked rainwater from his cheek. Jack sat there another 30 seconds before standing. He didn't apologize to himself. That was new. They kept walking. Near dusk, the road crested a low rise. Scout stopped first. Jack came up beside him. Below them stood a cabin. Not a shack. A real cabin. 2 weather-darkened windows faced the valley. Hand-hewn logs formed walls beneath a steep metal roof. A stone chimney rose above one end, and a narrow porch stretched across the front. Behind it stood a smaller workshop, and what looked like a woodshed. Beyond everything rose a granite ridge, dark against the last light. Jack stared. After months of waking beneath parking lot lamps, he couldn't quite understand what he was looking at. A door. A roof. Land where nobody could tell him he had been parked too long. Scout started downhill. Wait. The dog stopped. Jack took Silas's brass key from his pocket. He hadn't realized until that moment how tightly he'd been holding it. They crossed the clearing together. Jack climbed onto the porch. He touched the door before putting the key into the lock. Solid. The key turned. Inside smelled of cold ashes, old pine, dust, and something faintly metallic. Jack found a lantern near the door. A table. 2 chairs. Wood stove. Shelves. A narrow staircase. Nothing luxurious. Nothing easy. But nothing collapsing either. Jack set his pack down. Well. Scout walked through the room once, sniffing corners. Then he stopped. His head lifted. Jack followed his gaze. The northern window faced the granite ridge. Scout moved closer. His ears stood forward. Scout. No response. The dog stared into the gathering darkness. Jack crossed the room and looked outside. Trees, rock, a thin line of old fencing disappearing into brush. Nothing else. See a deer? Scout remained motionless. Jack touched his collar. The dog finally looked at him. Inside tonight. Jack closed the curtain. He built a small fire in the stove, checked the chimney draft, ate cold beans from a can, and shared a piece of jerky with Scout. Later, he unrolled his sleeping bag near the stove. For once, no truckers came and went. No headlights swept across glass. No security guard tapped on his window. There was only wind moving through pine trees and the quiet settling noises of an old cabin. Jack lay awake longer than he wanted to admit. Scout rested beside him. At some point, Jack drifted off. When he woke after midnight, the fire had burned low. Scout was no longer beside him. Jack sat up. The dog stood at the northern window, perfectly still. The curtain had been pushed aside by his muzzle. Moonlight silvered the granite ridge. Scout. One ear turned toward Jack. The rest of him remained focused outside. Jack got up and stood beside him. Nothing moved. Still, the old instincts returned. Jack studied the tree line, the slope, the shadows between rocks. He saw nothing. Scout saw or smelled something he couldn't. Jack rested a hand on the dog's back. Beneath his palm, every muscle was tight. Whatever had Scout's attention wasn't passing through. It was somewhere on that ridge, and the dog seemed certain it belonged there. Morning made the ridge look ordinary. That bothered Jack more than if it had looked threatening. Granite rose behind the cabin in broken gray shelves, interrupted by pine, juniper, and patches of yellow grass already bending beneath the first touch of winter. Whatever had held Scout at the window during the night had left no obvious sign. Jack stepped onto the porch with coffee in one hand. Scout went straight to the northern edge of the clearing. Not today. The dog looked back. We've got a house trying to kill us first. That was an exaggeration. Mostly. Silas had maintained the cabin better than Jack expected, but age had been working quietly everywhere. One section of roof flashing had pulled away from the chimney. The hand pump coughed rusty water before running clear. 2 batteries in the solar bank were dead. Cold air slipped around the kitchen window. Jack made a list. Water first, heat second, weather third. Everything else could wait. He found Silas's workshop behind the cabin and stopped in the doorway. Tools covered one wall. Not expensive tools, good ones. Axes with sharpened edges, hand saws, pipe wrenches, files, levels, a bench vise bolted to a scarred work table. Every tool had a place, and most had been cleaned before Silas put them away for the last time. Jack ran one finger across the bench. Almost no dust. Old man took care of things. Scout sniffed beneath a cabinet. Jack found spare pump seals in a labeled drawer. By noon, the water ran clear. By evening, the chimney no longer leaked. The following day, he patched the roof. After that came the windows. Work gave the hours edges. Jack liked problems that could be touched. A leaking fitting didn't care about Afghanistan. A warped door didn't ask why his marriage had ended. Split firewood never looked at him with concern. You found the problem. You corrected it. You moved on. People were harder. At first, Jack treated the property the way he had treated unfamiliar ground overseas. Each morning he walked the clearing before breakfast. Tracks, weather, fence line, anything disturbed overnight. He told himself he was learning the property. Part of that was true. The other part woke before he did. Scout followed at first, then learned the routine so well that he began making his own circuit. "Perimeter secure?" Jack asked one morning. Scout returned carrying a pine cone. Outstanding intelligence work. The dog dropped it at Jack's feet. Jack threw it. Scout brought it back. Again. By the fourth throw, Jack realized he was smiling. The days shortened. Temperatures fell. Jack recovered the pickup once the road dried enough to dig it free, then parked it beside the woodshed. For the first time in months, he removed his duffel bags from the truck. That was harder than it should have been. He stood beside the open tailgate staring at them. If everything remained packed, leaving took minutes. If he unpacked, he was assuming he could stay. Scout grabbed one end of the sleeping bag and dragged it toward the cabin. "That's mine." Scout kept going. Jack watched him disappear through the doorway. "Fine." That evening, Jack put clothes into Silas's empty dresser. Not all of them. Half. It was enough. Sleep remained more complicated. The silence of the mountains was different from silence in a truck. In the truck, there was always something. Tires on pavement, engines, doors closing, people talking. At the cabin, darkness arrived completely. Some nights, Jack could hear his own pulse. On the sixth night, wind rose after midnight. A dead branch scraped across the metal roof. Once, twice. Then it snapped. The crack was sharp and close. Jack hit the floor before his eyes opened. His shoulder struck the wall. One knee drove into the boards. His hands came up automatically as his body searched for equipment that hadn't been there in years. For several seconds, he didn't know where the door was. He smelled hot metal, dust, diesel. A voice somewhere far away shouted for a medic. Then something warm pressed against his ribs. Jack turned. Scout sat beside him. Not licking him. Not whining. Just touching him. Jack's breath came through clenched teeth. "Give me a second." Scout remained there. Jack looked around. Wood stove, table, moonlight, cabin, Wyoming. He put one palm flat against the floorboards. Cold pine. Real. Cabin. Scout's ear moved. Wind. Jack swallowed. Branch. His breathing slowed. Only then did Scout lower himself beside him. Jack stayed on the floor until dawn. The next morning he removed the broken branch from the roof and cut down 2 other dead limbs that could reach the cabin. He didn't pretend the work fixed what had happened. It simply made the next night safer. Weeks passed. The mountains changed color. The last gold leaves disappeared from the aspens, and snow began collecting in shaded places where sunlight couldn't reach. Jack developed a rhythm. Up before sunrise. Coffee. Check the stove. Walk with Scout. Work until noon. Eat. Repair something else. Cut wood before dark. Dinner. Read one of Silas's old books until sleep came. Somewhere inside those repetitive days, Jack began changing without noticing. His beard became trimmed. He washed clothes regularly. He stopped eating directly from cans. One morning he woke to sunlight on the bedroom wall. He stared at it, then looked at the clock. 7:12. Jack sat up. He had slept almost 6 hours. Scout lay beside the bed, awake. "You let me sleep?" The dog's tail tapped once. Jack looked through the window. Snow covered the clearing. For a few moments, nothing in his body was preparing to run. Then Scout stood. He went downstairs. Jack heard the door flap he'd installed for him swing once. By the time Jack reached the porch, Scout was already crossing the clearing toward the northern ridge. "Scout." The dog stopped, looked back, then continued. "Scout." This time the command was sharper. Scout stopped again. Jack pointed toward the cabin. "Here." The dog hesitated, then returned. Jack crouched and checked his paws. No injury, no burrs, nothing unusual. "What is up there?" Scout looked toward the ridge. That became the new pattern. Every morning, the same thing. Scout crossed the clearing, reached the old fence line, sniffed along it, then disappeared among the trees for several minutes before returning. Jack followed him once. The dog moved uphill along a route almost invisible beneath dead grass and snow. An old trail. Jack found weathered fence posts, several collapsed beneath brush. Rusted wire disappeared into the ground. The farther they went, the more Scout pulled ahead. Jack finally called him back, not without gear. Scout returned reluctantly. Jack looked uphill. The granite ridge stood silent above them. He still saw nothing unusual. But Silas's photograph came back to him. The old man hadn't been looking at the camera. He had been looking here. That night, Jack placed the photograph on the table beside Silas's property map. The documented 61 acres formed an awkward shape around the cabin. The northern boundary stopped below the ridge. Jack traced it with one finger. Scout lay beside the stove. "You've got me wondering now." Scout raised his head. Jack folded the map. "Tomorrow." But morning arrived colder than expected. Fresh snow covered the clearing. Jack stepped outside carrying 2 pieces of firewood. He stopped. Scout wasn't on the porch. Scout? Nothing. Jack set down the wood. Usually the dog returned before breakfast. Jack whistled. The sound traveled into the trees. No movement. His chest tightened. "Scout!" Still nothing. Jack crossed the clearing quickly. At the northern fence line he found Scout's tracks. Fresh. They climbed toward the ridge. Jack followed. 50 yards into the trees, the tracks changed. Scout's stride shortened. Then came a dark mark in the snow. Jack crouched. Blood. A second drop lay 3 feet farther uphill. Then another. Jack's face hardened. "Scout!" A bark answered from somewhere above. One bark, sharp. Jack moved faster. Branches slapped his jacket as he climbed. The blood trail crossed an old fence buried beneath brush and continued toward a granite outcrop. Jack came around the rock and stopped. Scout stood on 3 legs beside a collapsed wooden post. Blood darkened the fur along his rear leg. But the dog wasn't trying to come home. He was digging. Snow and frozen dirt flew backward between his paws. "Scout, leave it!" The dog dug harder. Jack dropped beside him and caught his collar. "Enough!" Scout struggled once, then stopped. Jack examined the injured leg. A deep slice, probably from hidden barbed wire. Easy. He pulled gauze from the field kit he carried whenever they left the clearing and pressed it against the wound. Scout's breathing slowed beneath his hands. "You're lucky." Then Jack noticed something in the hole. Metal, not wire. A rounded edge glinted beneath frozen soil beside the collapsed post. Jack cleared it carefully with his glove. A brass disc emerged, green with age, stamped with letters. Mercer. Below that, P7. And beneath both, a date. Jack stared at it. Scout nudged his wrist. The old marker sat several hundred yards beyond the boundary shown on Silas's modern property map. Jack looked down toward the cabin, then back at the brass disc. Whatever Parcel 7 had once been, according to the paperwork in Jack's kitchen, it didn't exist anymore. Jack's first concern wasn't the marker. It was Scout. "Come here, partner." The dog tried to put weight on his injured leg and immediately lifted it again. Jack slipped one arm beneath Scout's chest and another beneath his belly. 70 pounds of wet German Shepherd wasn't light, especially with Jack's bad knee protesting on the downhill slope. He carried him anyway. Every few yards, Jack stopped. Not because of Scout, because his own leg demanded it. "Don't tell anybody about this." Scout panted against his shoulder. "We'll both deny it." At the cabin, Jack cut away the fur around the wound and cleaned it under the brightest lamp he had. The old barbed wire had opened a 3-inch slice above Scout's rear hock, deep enough to need attention, but the bleeding slowed under pressure. Scout never snapped. When the antiseptic touched the cut, his entire body stiffened, and one paw pushed against Jack's chest. "I know." Jack wrapped the leg carefully. "You're done climbing mountains for a while." Scout looked toward the northern window. "I mean it." The next morning, Jack drove into Dubois. A veterinarian cleaned and closed the wound, prescribed antibiotics, and ordered restricted activity for 10 days. Jack paid with money he'd been saving for winter supplies. He didn't hesitate. On the way back, Scout lay across the passenger seat wearing a bandage and an expression of deep personal offense. Jack glanced over. Doctor said no running. Scout looked out the window. No digging. One ear moved. And definitely no mysterious survey work. That earned him a look. Jack smiled. But when they reached the cabin, his attention returned to the ridge. The brass marker had stayed where Scout found it. Jack had photographed it before leaving, along with the old fence line and surrounding terrain. That evening, he placed Silas's modern property description beside the photographs. Mercer, P7, 1948. He searched Silas's papers. Nothing. No Parcel 7. No reference to P7. The current deed described approximately 61 acres surrounding the cabin, with the northern boundary ending below the ridge. The marker stood beyond it. Jack called Evelyn Price. She listened quietly. "Could be an old subdivision," she said. "Wouldn't that appear somewhere?" Usually isn't an answer. No. It's an invitation to investigate. Evelyn gave him the name of someone at the county survey office. Rachel Bennett arrived 2 days later in a mud-splattered county pickup. She looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in insulated work pants and a faded canvas jacket. A GPS receiver sat behind the seat beside rolled maps and survey equipment. Scout barked once from the porch. Rachel stopped. "Friendly?" "Depends." "On whether you're friendly." Rachel looked at Scout. "Fair system." Scout sniffed her hand, then stepped aside. "You passed. I've had tougher inspections." Inside, Jack showed her the photograph first. Rachel leaned over the table. "P7. You recognize it?" "No." Good start. She ignored the sarcasm. Where exactly? Jack pointed through the northern window. About 600 yards uphill. Rachel looked at Scout's bandaged leg. He find it? He found the barbed wire first. Scout lowered his head onto his paws. Rachel smiled. Occupational hazard. They climbed to the marker slowly, so Scout wouldn't follow. Jack shut him inside the cabin, where his offended barking continued until they reached the trees. Rachel uncovered the brass disc with a brush. She photographed it from several angles. Then she took coordinates. Her expression changed. What? Give me a minute. She checked the receiver again, then pulled a tablet from her pack. The modern parcel map appeared on the screen. Rachel enlarged it. A bright boundary line crossed below their position. She pointed. Your current north line is there. Jack followed her finger downhill. That's what I told you. You're standing roughly 400 yards beyond it. Could Silas have owned this before? Sure. What happened to it? That's the question. They spent 3 hours on the ridge. Rachel located another collapsed post almost half a mile west. No brass disc. But beside it lay a squared stone, partly hidden beneath moss. Then another. Jack noticed the pattern before Rachel said anything. Line. Rachel nodded. Looks like one. It didn't follow the modern boundary. It ran northwest, toward higher country. Back at the cabin, Rachel connected her laptop to a small portable hotspot and pulled archived county references. Jack made coffee. Scout lay beside the table, but his eyes followed every movement. Rachel moved through decades of maps. Current, 1990s, 1970s. Older scans became harder to read. Then she stopped. Here. Jack came around the table. A faded map filled the screen. The cabin was there. So was the ridge. But the property lines were different. Much different. Rachel enlarged one section. P1, P3, P4, P7. Jack leaned closer. There it is. Yeah. Parcel 7 extended across the northern ridge and continued into a broad section of forest beyond it. How big? Can't tell accurately from this scan. Guess. Rachel looked at him. Several hundred acres just in this section. Jack stared at the map. Current deed says 61 total. I know. She pulled another record, then another. The boundaries changed between decades. Some parcels had been consolidated, others renumbered. Several disappeared into larger legal descriptions. Rachel's fingers stopped over the keyboard. This isn't unusual by itself. Old rural land records can be messy. But the physical monument is still there, and it matches this older map. She opened a tax index. Her brow tightened. Silas Mercer. Jack leaned closer. The name appeared repeatedly. Different parcel references. Different years. Some descriptions Jack didn't recognize. Why would he pay taxes on land that wasn't on his deed? Maybe he didn't. Rachel scrolled. Or maybe the deed you're holding isn't the whole chain. Jack looked toward the workshop. Silas's shelves. His careful labels. The old photograph. You think somebody made a mistake? Rachel didn't answer immediately. She took out a notebook. Surveyors don't start with conspiracies. We start with monuments, records, and measurements. That's not a no-no. Outside, afternoon light faded behind the ridge. Scout suddenly stood. He limped to the northern window. Jack noticed immediately. Scout. The dog stared uphill. Rachel followed his gaze. Does he do that often? Every day. Rachel closed the laptop. We need the original plats. Where? County archives? Maybe state land records. Possibly old federal filings depending on how this ground was patented. And if Parcel 7 belonged to Silas, then we determine where it went. Jack looked at the old map. Something else bothered him. Rachel. Yeah? These other parcel numbers. She looked. P3, P4, P9, P11. What about them? They're all Mercer. Rachel zoomed out. The screen redrew slowly. Parcel after parcel appeared across the mountains. Not one continuous block. A chain. Valleys, ridges, creek bottoms, old access corridors. Jack's eyes followed them north and west until the screen couldn't hold all of them. How much land are we looking at? Rachel sat back. I don't know, roughly. She hesitated. Potentially thousands of acres. The cabin went very quiet. Jack looked down at Scout. 10 days earlier, the dog had been digging beside a broken fence post because something beneath the snow had caught his attention. A piece of brass. That was all. Yet that piece of brass had just opened a question stretching miles across the Wyoming mountains. Jack picked up Silas's photograph again. The old man's eyes were turned toward the ridge. For the first time, Jack no longer believed it was accidental. Silas had known something was wrong with this land. And somewhere before he died, Jack suspected, the old man had tried to leave behind enough evidence for someone to prove it. Scout's stitches came out 9 days later. The veterinarian approved short walks. Scout apparently heard only the word walks. The moment they returned to the cabin, he headed toward the northern ridge. Jack caught his collar. Absolutely not. Scout looked offended. You've already donated enough blood to this investigation. Rachel laughed from the porch. She had returned carrying 2 archive boxes, rolled maps, and a portable scanner. What had started as curiosity about one brass marker had become something neither of them could easily dismiss. For 3 days they worked inside Silas's workshop. The old man had saved nearly everything. Tax receipts, survey invoices, certified letters, topographic maps, handwritten notes about snowpack, creek levels, fence repairs, and access roads. At first, the records looked like the habits of a meticulous recluse. Then patterns emerged. A 1978 letter challenged the description of a boundary adjustment north of the cabin. A 1986 tax receipt listed Parcel 7 under Silas's name. A 1993 map showed Mercer holdings extending along 2 tributaries that no longer appeared anywhere on Jack's current deed. Then came a certified letter from Silas to a county office. The first page survived. The second didn't. Rachel held the empty staple holes toward the light. Removed. By Silas? Maybe. Jack opened another folder. Same problem. A property dispute. First page. Missing attachment. Another letter referred to an original 1948 instrument. That document was gone too. Jack leaned against the workbench. So we have references to evidence, but not the evidence. Convenient. Rachel glanced at him. Don't get ahead of what we can prove. I spent years learning that when 3 things don't line up, waiting for the 4th usually gets somebody hurt. This isn't Afghanistan. Jack looked at her. I know. The answer came sharper than he intended. Silence settled between them. Scout lifted his head from his blanket. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. Sorry. Rachel folded the letter. My dad fought fires for 32 years. When he retired, he'd smell smoke in places nobody else did. Jack looked at her. Was there smoke? Sometimes. And the other times? He checked anyway. Jack nodded once. That was enough. Late that afternoon, Jack found a ledger behind a row of rusted drill bits. It contained columns of numbers, 17 to 42, N68W, P7. Then another sequence. Jack studied it. Rachel glanced over. Measurements? Bearings. She took the book. Could be. Jack walked outside. The granite ridge was visible between trees. He checked the compass Silas had left hanging beside the workshop door. Then he looked at the notebook again. N68WW. Rachel followed him. Jack sighted northwest. The bearing pointed almost directly toward the ridge. These aren't financial numbers. Rachel turned pages faster. More bearings. Distances. Small triangles. Cross marks. He mapped something, without drawing the map. Jack spread Silas's old topographic sheet across the porch table. They began plotting. One bearing intersected the location of the P7 marker. Another pointed toward the squared stones they'd found farther west. A third followed the abandoned sheep trail climbing behind the cabin. Rachel stared at the completed sequence. That's a route, Jack nodded. Silas had documented it in fragments. A person glancing through the notebook would see meaningless numbers. A person standing on the ground could follow them. The next morning they tried. Scout came too. Jack had lost that argument before breakfast. The dog still favored the injured leg slightly, so Jack kept the pace slow. The route climbed beyond the old P7 marker, crossed a shallow drainage, then turned west along a trail nearly swallowed by brush. Scout moved ahead. Easy. The dog slowed. Jack studied the terrain. Old stonework appeared beside the trail. Not natural. Rocks had been stacked waist-high decades ago, then partially collapsed beneath frost and roots. Rachel photographed everything. This might have been a boundary wall or an access line. Either way, somebody put serious labor into it. They followed the wall. Snow began falling around noon, light flakes at first, then heavier. Jack looked toward the sky. We've got maybe 2 hours before visibility goes. Rachel checked the map. Next bearing is only 300 yards. Jack considered it. Scout was already looking uphill. 300. The terrain steepened. Trees grew tighter together. Jack noticed Scout stop beside an old spruce. The dog's nose lifted. Then he pulled left. Scout. The dog ignored him. Jack followed. The stone line appeared again beneath the snow. Scout moved faster. Scout. Slow. The dog reached a cluster of granite slabs. He sniffed between them, then scratched. Jack approached. Nothing. Just stone, frozen earth, and brush. Rachel checked the notebook. This is almost exactly where Silas's final bearing ends. Jack crouched. A narrow depression ran through the ground. Too straight. He brushed away snow. More fitted stones. Scout pushed past him. Back. The dog pulled toward a dark opening beneath a fallen timber. Jack grabbed his collar. Scout. The German shepherd twisted free. Scout, here! For the first time since they'd arrived in Wyoming, Scout ignored a direct command. He crossed the collapsed stone line. Jack stepped after him. His right boot landed on what looked like solid ground. It wasn't. The surface broke with a dry crack. Jack dropped. His left knee struck stone. His right leg vanished into darkness. The ground beneath his hands began collapsing. Jack! Rachel lunged forward. Jack flattened himself instinctively, spreading his weight. Loose dirt poured beneath him. His hips slid toward the opening. Then something seized his jacket sleeve. Scout. The dog had clamped onto the heavy canvas near Jack's elbow. "Back!" Scout pulled. Jack drove his left forearm against the stone edge. Rachel grabbed the shoulder of his jacket. Together they dragged him away as another section of earth collapsed. For several seconds, nobody moved. Jack lay on his back, breathing hard. Snow landed on his face. Scout stood over him, still gripping the torn sleeve. Jack looked at him. "You can let go," Scout didn't. "I'm not going anywhere." The dog finally released him. Rachel sat in the snow beside Jack. "You okay?" Jack flexed his right ankle. "Knee's going to complain." "Anything else?" "Pride." "Good. Pride doesn't require evacuation." Jack almost laughed. Then he rolled over and looked at the hole. The collapse had exposed something beneath the hillside. Not a natural cavity. A squared opening. Stone walls descended vertically on both sides. Jack crawled closer, keeping his weight back. He took out his flashlight. The beam disappeared downward. 8 feet, maybe 12. At the bottom, something reflected the light. Metal. Rachel leaned beside him. "What is that?" Jack shifted the beam. A rusted iron bracket was bolted into the stone wall. Below it were steps. Actual steps, cut into rock. Scout stood behind them, nose working rapidly. Jack looked at Silas's notebook. The final bearing ended here. The old man hadn't been marking a boundary. He'd been marking the way to something. Snow fell into the opening and vanished into darkness. Rachel whispered, "Silas built this?" Jack shook his head. "Maybe." He swept the flashlight farther down. The beam reached what looked like a wooden door or support frame beneath the earth. Jack's pulse changed. Not panic, recognition. Hidden spaces had rules. You didn't rush into them. You checked stability, air, access, a second way out if one existed. He sat back. "We're not going down today." Rachel looked at the worsening snow. Agreed. Scout stepped toward the hole. Jack caught his collar. "Especially you." Scout stared into the darkness. Jack followed his gaze. For weeks he'd believed the mystery was about missing property lines. Now he understood the lines had only been directions. Silas hadn't merely been trying to prove that land had disappeared from the records. He had hidden the proof somewhere beneath it. They returned the following morning. The storm had passed, leaving 6 inches of fresh snow and a hard blue sky over the ridge. Jack carried more equipment this time. Rope, harness, headlamp, gloves, first aid kit, 2 flashlights, and a compact gas detector Rachel had borrowed from the county road department. No improvising. No unnecessary risk. Scout walked beside him. "You're staying topside." Scout ignored the announcement. At the opening, Jack cleared loose soil until they could see the stonework properly. The steps descended roughly 12 feet before turning beneath the ridge. Rachel lowered the detector first. They waited. No warning. "Still doesn't mean good air everywhere," Jack said. "You always this cheerful." "Kept me alive." He anchored the rope around a thick pine well beyond the disturbed ground, then established a second anchor using a granite outcrop. He checked both twice. Rachel noticed. "You don't trust knots?" "I trust checked knots." Jack put on the harness. Scout immediately stood. "No." The dog stepped closer. "Rachel stays here. You stay with Rachel." Scout's ears lowered. Jack crouched. "I mean it." He touched the dog's chest. "Stay." This time Scout obeyed. Jack descended. The stone steps were narrow but solid. Moisture glistened along the walls, and the temperature dropped noticeably as he went deeper. At the bottom, his headlamp revealed a low chamber extending beneath the ridge. Not treasure, not gold, mostly decay. Wooden shelves had collapsed along one wall. Rusted survey tripods leaned in a corner. Metal boxes sat beneath rotting canvas. An old lantern hung from a beam, blackened by age. The ceiling was supported by squared timbers. Jack tested the nearest one before moving beneath it. "How does it look?" Rachel called. "Old, very technical, stable enough near the entrance." He advanced slowly. The chamber opened into a second section carved directly into rock. Here, conditions were different. Drier, colder, intentional. 3 waterproof document tubes rested on a shelf. A steel field chest sat beneath them. Jack stopped. "Rachel." "What?" "We've got storage." She descended after securing Scout's leash to a tree. Scout objected loudly. "I think he disagrees with your command structure," Rachel said when she reached the bottom. "He can file a complaint." They examined the tubes first. Inside were rolled survey plats, old ones, some handwritten, others professionally drafted on heavy paper yellowed at the edges. Rachel handled them carefully. "Oh, Jack, what?" She unrolled one against the steel chest. Across the top were the words, "Mercer Family Holdings." The date was 1948. Parcel numbers spread across the map. P1, P3, P4, P7, P9, P11. More. Jack recognized the pattern immediately. The ridge, and beyond it. Rachel traced the boundary. The holdings stretched north through timber, west across 2 drainages, and south along a creek corridor. Jack stared. "How much?" "I need scale." She checked, then checked again. Thousands. The steel chest was locked. Its brass padlock had corroded almost solid. Jack found a rusted pry bar nearby. The lock gave after several attempts. Inside were folders wrapped in waxed cloth. The first contained tax records. The second held photographs of survey monuments. Each photograph had a date and location written on the back. Rachel found the third bundle. She stopped breathing for a moment. "What?" "Deeds." Jack moved beside her. There were several. Original conveyances, property transfers, water right documents, access agreements. Some went back generations. Rachel read silently for almost a minute. "This isn't enough by itself." Jack looked at her. "You just said deeds." "I said they're deeds. I didn't say a court automatically accepts everything in this box. We need authentication, recording history, chain of title. We need to compare these against county and state archives." "But?" Rachel looked around the chamber. But Silas didn't hide junk. She unfolded another document. Her finger stopped halfway down. "Here." A legal description connected multiple Mercer parcels under one ownership chain. She read the acreage. 8,712. Jack thought he'd heard wrong. "Say that again." "Approximately 8,700 acres. My deed says 61. I know." Jack stared at the paper. He had spent months measuring his life in gallons of gasoline. Now a document beneath a mountain claimed his great-uncle's holdings had once stretched across more land than Jack could walk in a day. He felt no excitement, only suspicion. Why hide it? Rachel looked at him. Maybe because somebody didn't want it found. A sound came from above. Scout. One sharp bark. Jack's head turned instantly. Another bark. Lower. Different. Warning. Rachel whispered. "What's that mean?" Jack switched off his headlamp. Darkness swallowed the chamber. "Jack, kill yours." Rachel obeyed. Blackness became absolute. Jack listened. Scout wasn't barking anymore. That worried him more. Then came a scrape. Above them, boot against stone. Jack's body changed before his thoughts did. Breathing shallow, shoulders loose, head angled toward the opening. For several seconds, Wyoming vanished. He was back beneath a hard Afghan sky, listening for movement outside a compound wall while dust worked into his teeth. He pressed 2 fingers against the stone. Cold. Wet. Real. Wyoming. He heard Scout growl. Then footsteps. Slow. Someone was moving near the opening. Rachel leaned close. Could be an animal. Jack shook his head, though she could barely see him. Scout knows animals. The footsteps stopped. Jack reached upward until his hand found the dog's leash line hanging near the entrance. He didn't climb. Whoever was outside had the advantage if Jack exposed himself through the opening. So he waited. 10 seconds. 20. A minute. His pulse hammered in his ears. Then Scout barked violently. Something moved fast through the brush. Branches snapped. Footsteps retreated across frozen ground. Scout lunged against his leash. Scout! Jack climbed quickly but stopped below the opening. He raised only enough to see through the edge. Empty snow. Trees. Scout pulling north. Rachel came behind him. See anyone? No. Jack climbed out. Scout immediately pushed against him, then turned toward the trees. Jack scanned the snow. Tracks. Bootprints. Not theirs. Fresh impressions approached from the west, stopped near the opening, then turned away. Jack followed them 20 yards. They disappeared onto exposed granite where snow couldn't hold a print. Someone was here, Rachel said. Jack looked downhill. The cabin was barely visible through the trees. Someone knew where to come. Rachel's face tightened. Or followed us. That possibility was worse. They didn't remove the entire collection. Not yet. Jack photographed every bundle in place, then selected the most important deeds and plats. Rachel sealed them inside waterproof evidence sleeves she carried for field documents. Before leaving, Jack searched the chest one more time. At the bottom lay a photograph. Silas stood beside the P7 marker. He looked younger. Behind him were 2 men Jack didn't recognize. Written across the back in Silas's handwriting were 6 words. They will erase what they cannot buy. Jack read it twice. Rachel looked over his shoulder. That's not exactly comforting. No. They climbed out. Scout stayed close to Jack all the way down the ridge. At the cabin, Jack locked the documents inside Silas's heavy workshop safe. Then he checked every window, every door, every track around the clearing. The habits he'd begun to soften returned with purpose. Not panic. Observation. Someone had come to the ridge while they were underground. Someone had known enough to look there. That evening, as snow began falling again, Jack sat beside the stove with Scout against his leg, and the 1948 plat spread across the table. 8,700 acres, missing from the modern deed, original documents hidden beneath stone, and fresh boot prints above the chamber. Jack had inherited a worthless cabin. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether somebody else desperately needed him to keep believing it was worthless. The answer arrived the next afternoon in a black SUV. Jack heard the engine before he saw it. Scout heard it earlier. The dog rose from beside the stove and moved to the front window, body still, ears forward. Jack stepped onto the porch. A polished SUV emerged from the trees and stopped beside his battered Ford. It looked wrong in the clearing. Clean black paint, expensive wheels, tinted glass. The driver's door opened. The man who climbed out was perhaps 50, tall, gray at the temples, wearing a dark wool coat over clothes that had never met a grease stain. "Mr. Mercer? Who wants to know?" The man smiled. "Victor Hale." He extended a hand. Jack didn't move. After a second, Hale lowered it. "I'm with Blackstone Mineral and Land." Scout appeared beside Jack. Hale glanced at the dog. "Beautiful shepherd. What do you want? Straight to business. I respect that." Hale opened his coat and removed a leather folder. Jack watched him. Not the folder. The boots. Clean. Too clean. The access road was mud and melting snow for nearly 2 miles. Even Rachel's county boots arrived dirty. Hale had either changed shoes or hadn't walked far from his vehicle. Neither mattered much. What mattered was that he'd come prepared. "We're assembling property interests in this area," Hale said. "Access, mineral rights, some development opportunities. Your great-uncle declined several conversations with us. Sounds like he answered you." Hale smiled again. Silas was old-fashioned. "So am I. That's why I'm here personally." He opened the folder. $450,000. Jack looked at him. "For what?" "Your property. 61 acres? Cabin included." Jack almost laughed. Dana had implied the place might barely cover the expense of selling it. Now a stranger had driven into the mountains offering nearly $500,000 without inspecting the roof. "That's generous. We prefer efficient." Jack leaned against a porch post. Scout remained against his left leg. "Why do you need my 60 acres? "Access. 2. Potential future projects." "What kind?" "Nothing finalized." Jack nodded slowly. Hale talked for another 5 minutes. He used phrases like regional investment and responsible development. Jack barely listened. He watched. Hale's SUV was parked facing downhill. Quick departure. Hale checked the ridge 3 times while speaking. Not the cabin. The ridge. On the 4th glance, Jack was certain. "You been up there?" Hale's eyes returned immediately. "Where?" "The ridge." "No." "Too fast." Scout stepped forward. Hale looked down. The dog's hackles had risen. "Easy. He's easy." Hale closed the folder. "Mr. Mercer, I'm trying to offer you something most people in your position would consider life-changing." "My position?" Hale hesitated. Jack's voice stayed quiet. "What exactly is my position? I understand you've had financial difficulties." There it was. Jack felt his jaw tighten. "Who told you?" "Property transactions involve due diligence. Homelessness isn't on a deed. No offense intended. Then don't use it to price me." For the first time, Hale's smile disappeared. Only briefly. Then it returned. Silas didn't leave behind any old survey documents, did he? The clearing seemed to go silent. Jack didn't move. Scout did. The dog stepped fully between them. Hale's gaze dropped. Jack heard the sentence again. Survey documents. He had told Evelyn. Rachel. Nobody else. Certainly not Blackstone. What documents? Hale studied him. Silas was known for keeping old records. You said survey documents. A figure of speech. No. Jack pushed away from the porch post. It wasn't. Hale slipped the folder beneath his arm. Think about the offer. I just did. $450,000 could buy you a comfortable house anywhere you want. I've got a house. Hale looked at the cabin. His expression said enough. Jack pointed toward the road. "We're done." Hale stood another moment, then nodded. "Offers don't stay open forever." "Good." The SUV disappeared between the trees. Scout remained staring after it. Jack waited until the engine could no longer be heard. Then he called Rachel. "Blackstone know you're researching the Mercer parcels?" "No." "Why?" "Because Victor Hale just asked whether Silas left survey documents." Silence. "Jack, don't touch anything in that underground chamber." "I wasn't planning to." "And call Evelyn." "I will. Today." Jack looked toward the ridge. "Yeah." Darkness came early. By 7, wind pushed against the cabin walls. Jack checked the doors before bed, then checked them again. He hated himself for the second check. At 1:13 in the morning, Scout woke him, not barking. A low growl. Jack's eyes opened. Scout stood beside the bed facing downstairs. Jack listened. Wind. Wood stove. Then something else. Crunch. Snow beneath weight. Outside. Jack sat up slowly. Scout moved toward the stairs. "Wait." The dog stopped. Jack pulled on his boots and descended. Another sound. Closer. Scout's growl deepened. Jack killed the lamp. Darkness. He moved toward the rear of the cabin, staying away from the windows. A faint beam crossed the clearing outside. Flashlight. Gone. Then came a metallic click near the workshop. Jack's pulse accelerated. He touched Scout's collar. "Stay." Scout trembled beneath his hand. A shadow moved past the kitchen window. Then glass shattered. Scout exploded forward. "Scout!" The dog hit the rear door before Jack could catch him. Jack opened it rather than let Scout injure himself trying to force through. Scout vanished into the darkness. "Scout! Here!" Branches cracked beyond the workshop. A man shouted. Then came a sharp yelp. Jack's stomach dropped. "Scout!" He grabbed his flashlight and ran. The beam cut across snow. Tracks. 2 sets. 1 human, 1 dog. An engine started somewhere beyond the trees. Jack reached the edge of the clearing as headlights flashed through the forest. A vehicle accelerated down the road. "Scout!" Nothing. Then movement appeared between the pines. Scout limped into the light. Jack ran to him. The dog took 3 more steps and stopped. Dark blood streaked his right shoulder. No, come here." Jack dropped to his knees. His hands found the wound. A long cut ran through Scout's coat near the shoulder. Not deep enough to expose bone, but ugly. Fresh. Scout's breathing came fast. Jack pressed gauze against it. The dog leaned into him. "Stay with me." The words escaped before Jack could stop them. Suddenly, he wasn't kneeling in Wyoming snow. He was beside a road outside Ghazni. Dust in his mouth. A friend on the ground. His gloves slick. Someone screaming for the medevac. Jack's breath locked. Scout nudged his chin. Jack blinked. Snow. Pines. Cabin. Scout. Right. He swallowed hard. "You're here." Jack wrapped the shoulder firmly and carried the dog inside. Only after Scout was settled near the stove did Jack inspect the cabin. The broken window was beside the rear door. Outside, bootprints led toward Silas's workshop. Whoever had come hadn't been interested in food, or the truck, or the cabin. The workshop door showed fresh marks near the lock. Jack stood beneath the porch light, staring at them. Then he looked toward the ridge. Victor Hale had asked about survey documents that afternoon. Hours later, somebody had come onto the property and tried to enter the building where Jack had stored them. Jack went back inside. Scout raised his head weakly. Jack sat on the floor beside him and placed one hand against the dog's ribs. The dog had warned him, again, and this time Scout had paid for it. Jack stayed there until dawn, listening to the wind and feeling each breath rise beneath his palm. When daylight finally reached the windows, fear had hardened into something quieter. Whoever wanted Silas's records had made one mistake. They had stopped being interested in land. They had hurt Scout, and Jack Mercer was no longer considering any offer from anyone. Sheriff Owen Brooks arrived shortly after sunrise. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a weathered face and the patient manner of someone who preferred facts to theories. He photographed the broken window, the damaged workshop lock, the tracks in the snow, and the dark drops of Scout's blood leading back toward the cabin. Anything stolen? Not that I can tell. Anything valuable in the workshop? Jack looked at him. Documents. Brooks stopped writing. What kind? Old property records. Jack told him about the underground shelter, the deeds, the missing acreage, Victor Hale's visit, and the question Hale should never have known to ask. Brooks listened without interrupting. When Jack finished, the sheriff closed his notebook. Move the originals. Already planned on it. Don't plan, do. By noon, Scout was lying on a padded blanket in the back of Rachel's county vehicle while Jack drove behind them toward town. The veterinarian cleaned the wound and placed 14 stitches along Scout's shoulder. Another inch lower, and we'd be talking about muscle damage, she said. Jack's hand remained on Scout's neck. Will he be okay? He'll be sore. Keep him quiet. Jack looked at Scout. Apparently nobody has told him what that means. The veterinarian almost smiled. From there, they drove directly to Evelyn Price's office. Evelyn had already arranged secure storage for the original deeds and plats. By late afternoon, everything important from the steel chest had been photographed, cataloged, sealed, and placed where no midnight visitor could reach it through a cabin window. Then the slow work began. Title specialists compared Silas's papers against archived county records. Rachel checked historical survey coordinates. Evelyn requested tax records going back decades. Jack waited. Waiting had never been something he did well. 3 days later, another vehicle came up the mountain. Scout was asleep beside the stove. Then his head snapped up. A growl rolled through his chest. Jack looked through the window. A silver luxury pickup stopped beside the cabin. His brother stepped out. Grant Mercer wore a wool jacket that probably cost more than Jack's truck. Dana climbed from the passenger side. Jack felt something inside him go cold. Grant opened his arms as though they were arriving for Thanksgiving. Jack, what are you doing here? We heard what happened. From who? Grant hesitated. Dana stepped in. Evelyn contacted family during the title review. Jack stared at her. Evelyn would never have discussed confidential records with them. Scout came slowly from the stove. His shoulder was shaved around the stitches. He stopped at the doorway. Growled again. Grant frowned. What's wrong with him? He doesn't like your truck. He's a dog. Yeah. Jack looked past his brother toward the vehicle. That's why I listen. Dana tried to smile. We're worried about you. Jack almost shut the door. Grant put a hand against it. Come on. Don't do this. Do what? Turn everyone into an enemy. Jack's eyes moved to Grant's hand. Grant removed it. We heard you're making claims about thousands of acres, Dana said. Do you understand how this looks? Like a title dispute. It looks like you've been alone in the mountains too long. Jack said nothing. Grant lowered his voice. You've had a rough few years. Nobody's judging you. Jack laughed once. There was no humor in it. That's almost impressive. What? Getting that sentence out with a straight face. Scout moved closer. Grant glanced at the bandage. What happened? Someone came here at night. Dana's expression changed for half a second. Small, but Jack saw it. Someone? Scout found him. Grant looked toward the workshop. Jack saw that too. Funny, Jack said. What? I didn't tell you where they tried to break in. Grant's jaw tightened. We're trying to help. No. You're trying to learn what I know. Jack stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. Scout followed. Leave. Dana folded her arms. You need to think carefully. If those deeds are real, this could become complicated. There are corporations involved, lawyers, developers. You don't know that world. Apparently you do. Jack. Who told you about Blackstone? Silence. Grant looked at Dana. Wrong move. Jack walked toward the silver pickup. Don't. Grant followed. Jack opened the passenger door before his brother could stop him. A coffee cup sat in the console. Receipts. A leather folder. Then Jack saw the plastic card tucked beside the seat. Blackstone Mineral and Land. Visitor access. Grant Mercer. Jack removed it. Grant's face changed. No concern now. No brotherly warmth. Just anger. Give me that. Jack held it up. How much? It's not what you think. How much? Dana exhaled. Victor contacted us weeks ago. Weeks before Hale came to the cabin. Jack looked at her. Why? He knew Silas had disputed acreage. He thought family might help make the transfer easier. Transfer. Grant stepped closer. He offered a commission if we helped negotiate a sale. That's business, Jack. How much? Grant looked away. Dana answered. Enough. Jack nodded. Enough to come find the brother you forgot existed. Don't start that. Grant's voice hardened. You disappeared. I came home from Afghanistan and couldn't sleep. You pushed everyone away. I asked you for a place to stay. You scared my kids. The words hit harder than Grant probably intended. Jack went still. Grant saw it and kept going. You paced all night. You checked windows. A car backfired and you hit the floor in my driveway. What was I supposed to do? Jack's hands curled. You could have treated me like your brother. I did until it became impossible. Scout moved between them. Grant pointed toward the dog. And now look at you, living out here, chasing conspiracy theories because an old man buried paperwork in a mountain. They broke into my cabin. Did you see them? Jack said nothing. Grant smiled. Small. Cruel. Exactly. A truck came down the valley road. Its exhaust cracked sharply against the cold air. Jack dropped half a step before he could stop himself. His shoulder turned. His right hand moved instinctively toward his sabha. Palm, mountains disappeared for one terrible second. Dust. A blast wall. Radio chatter. Contact left. Then Wyoming returned. Grant was watching him and smiling. There. Grant's voice softened. That's what I'm talking about. Jack stepped toward him. Everything narrowed. Grant's face. Distance, angle. One movement. Jack could end the smile. Scout limped between them. The dog pressed his injured shoulder against Jack's knees. Jack froze. Scout looked up. The stitches were still visible beneath the shaved fur. Jack's fist slowly opened. His breathing came through his nose. Once. Twice. Again. He stepped backward. Grant's smile faded. Jack looked at the visitor pass in his hand, then at his brother. "You wanted me to hit you." Grant said nothing. "So you could tell somebody I was unstable. You're imagining things." "Maybe." Jack handed the pass to Sheriff Brooks 2 hours later. Grant and Dana had already left. Brooks placed it inside an evidence sleeve. Smart thing was not hitting him. Didn't feel smart. Usually doesn't. Scout lay beside Jack's chair in the sheriff's office. Jack looked down at him. The dog was asleep, exhausted, still healing, still protecting him. That evening, Evelyn called. Her voice sounded different, careful. "Jack, the first title report came back." He stood beside the cabin window. "What does it say?" "It says Silas's documents aren't random copies. Several match archived records that were later omitted from consolidated mapping." Jack's grip tightened around the phone. "So the land is real?" "Some of the claim appears very real. How much? We're not ready to say." Jack watched snow move across the clearing. Evelyn continued, "But there's something else. Blackstone has been researching that same corridor for years." Jack looked toward the northern ridge. "Why?" "We're working on that." Scout woke and lifted his head. Jack remembered Hale's offer, Grant's visitor pass, Dana's knowledge, the footprints above the underground chamber. Separate pieces were beginning to form one shape. His family hadn't suddenly returned because they were worried about him. Blackstone hadn't offered nearly $500,000 because it wanted 60 worthless acres, and somebody hadn't risked breaking into the cabin because of an old survey disagreement. Whatever Silas had protected beneath that mountain, its value wasn't measured only in acreage. Someone already knew what the land was worth. Jack was simply the last person they wanted to find out. The answer took 19 days. 19 days of waiting while strangers in offices studied papers Silas had protected for decades. Rachel returned to the ridge with 2 survey crews. They located 4 more monuments, including one nearly buried beneath a fallen pine and another beside a creek where the modern county map showed no Mercer boundary at all. Evelyn searched archived filings. A title company reconstructed transfers going back generations. Water specialists examined rights attached to the old parcels. A mineral consultant asked questions Jack barely understood. Through all of it, Jack stayed at the cabin. Scout healed. The stitches came out, leaving a narrow pink scar beneath the fur on his shoulder. His limp disappeared gradually, though Jack still stopped him whenever he tried to charge uphill after deer. At night, Jack slept badly. Every engine on the access road woke him. Every branch against the roof became a footstep until proven otherwise. He began leaving his boots beside the bed again. Scout noticed. Of course he noticed. On the 19th morning, Evelyn called. "Can you come to my office?" Jack looked at Scout. "Is that a lawyer way of saying I should sit down?" "Yes." 3 hours later, Jack sat across from Evelyn with Rachel beside him and Scout resting beneath the table. 4 people joined by video conference. A title specialist, a land appraiser, a water rights attorney, and a geologist representing neither Jack nor Blackstone. Evelyn folded her hands. "We need to start with a warning. Nothing you're about to hear is guaranteed until the title issues survive judicial review." Jack nodded. Understood. The title specialist shared a map. The 61 acres Jack had inherited appeared in yellow. Then another layer appeared. Parcel 7. Then more. The colored area spread across ridges, timber, creeks, and high mountain basins until Jack's little cabin looked like a pin dropped near one corner. The surviving evidence supports a historical Mercer interest, totaling approximately 8,700 acres. Jack stared at the screen. He had seen the old plat. Seeing it matched against modern terrain was different. Rachel pointed toward a narrow corridor running through the center. This is what Blackstone wants. The geologist spoke next. Not simply the acreage. Another map appeared. Access routes, watershed boundaries, subsurface zones. Blackstone has assembled interests on both sides of the disputed Mercer holdings, but they don't control a continuous corridor. Jack understood immediately. We're in the middle. Essentially. The water rights attorney added another layer. 2 tributaries began high inside the disputed tract. Older filings indicated Mercer rights associated with both. Access easements crossed the same ground. Then came the subsurface interests. Each piece alone had value. Together, they created leverage. Jack looked at Evelyn. How much? The appraiser cleared his throat. There are several ways to value something like this. How much? At ordinary rural acreage values, considerably less than the number you're expecting. I'm not expecting anything. The man nodded. But this isn't an ordinary acreage transaction. If the title is upheld, the combination of land position, access control, water interests, and associated subsurface rights gives the property strategic value to parties seeking to assemble the corridor. He paused. Jack disliked the pause. Current estimates place the potential combined value as high as $265 million. Nothing moved. Jack heard the heating vent. A clock. Someone shifting paper on the video call. Scouts breathing beneath the table. Million? Yes. Jack looked at Rachel. She didn't smile. That helped. 265. Potentially, Evelyn said. Not cash in an account. Not guaranteed. Not tomorrow. Jack leaned back. For years he had counted quarters before buying coffee. He knew exactly how many miles his truck could travel after the fuel light came on. He had slept behind warehouses because rest areas sometimes moved vehicles along after midnight. $265 million didn't fit anywhere inside that life. His mind rejected it. He reached beneath the table. Scout lifted his head into Jack's hand. Jack scratched behind one ear. What's wrong? Rachel asked quietly. Nothing. You look like somebody just gave you bad news. Jack stared at the map. Numbers that big usually belong to people who can afford trouble. Nobody answered. That evening, Jack returned to the cabin alone. He lit the stove, fed Scout, then went into Silas's workshop. The old room smelled of machine oil, pine dust, and cold iron. Jack sat on the stool where Silas must have spent thousands of evenings repairing tools and recording measurements. He wrote the number on a scrap of paper. $265 million. He stared at it. Then at Scout. The dog's shoulder had been shaved again, where the veterinarian removed the stitches. The scar looked pale beneath the growing fur. Jack crumpled the paper. The number hadn't protected Scout. It had helped put blood on the snow. 3 days later, Victor Hale made another offer. Not in person this time. Through attorneys. Evelyn brought the document to the cabin. Jack read the first page standing beside the kitchen table. $18 million. Cash transaction. Fast closing. Blackstone would assume the litigation risk and title expenses. Jack would relinquish every disputed claim, associated access right, water interest, and subsurface interest. He could walk away. No years in court. No survey battles. No strangers driving onto his property. No brother showing up with someone else's agenda. No Scout waking to footsteps outside the window. $18 million is real, Evelyn said. The 265 estimate is conditional. Jack kept reading. You think I should take it? I think you should understand what they're buying before you decide. I understand what 18 million buys. Do you? Jack looked around the cabin. A new truck. A warm house somewhere easy. Veterinary care for Scout for the rest of his life. No sleeping behind a steering wheel. No choosing between fuel and food. No wondering whether the next maintenance job would last through winter. He could disappear. For the first time since the letter arrived, disappearing sounded good. That night, wind rolled down from the ridge. Jack sat at the table with Blackstone's offer in front of him. Scout slept near the stove. Jack picked up a pen. He read the signature line. His name waited there. $18 million for land he hadn't known existed a month earlier. A sane man might take it. A tired man almost certainly would. Jack was tired. He thought about the broken window, Scout bleeding beneath his hands, Grant smiling after the truck backfired, the footsteps above the underground chamber. Then another thought came. Silas. A solitary old veteran had spent decades preserving markers, receipts, bearings, deeds, and photographs. He had hidden them beneath stone, not sold them, not destroyed them, not surrendered them even when Blackstone came asking. Why? Jack lowered the pen. Scout's eyes opened. The dog rose slowly, stretched, and walked toward the door. Not tonight. Scout stared at him. Snow's coming. Scout scratched once at the door, then looked toward the northern window, the ridge. Jack followed his gaze. No, Scout scratched again. Jack sighed. 5 minutes later, they were outside. The moon was thin, but snow reflected enough light to make the forest glow faintly. Scout moved uphill. Not fast. Purposeful. Jack followed with his headlamp. Where are you going? Scout took the old sheep trail, straight toward the underground shelter. Jack stopped. Scout. The dog looked back, then continued. By the time Jack reached the opening, Scout was already pawing at the secured cover. Jack stared at him. You've got to be kidding. Scout whined. Something about the sound changed Jack's mind. He opened the entrance. Inside, Scout descended carefully beside him. The chamber smelled exactly as before. Cold stone, old timber, rust. Most of the important documents had been removed. Scout ignored the empty chest, ignored the shelves. He went to the far wall, then stopped beside one of the heavy timber braces supporting the rock above. He sniffed, scratched. Jack aimed his light. There's nothing there. Scout scratched again. Jack moved closer. The timber looked ordinary. Then he noticed the dust line. One edge had shifted. Recently? Or years ago as the mountain settled? Jack ran his fingers behind it. There was space. He carefully cleared loose debris. Something crackled beneath his glove. Paper. No. Waxed cloth. Jack pulled out a narrow weather-sealed envelope. Behind it sat a small black field notebook. His name was written across the envelope. Not Silas's. His. Jack Mercer. Jack stood motionless beneath the mountain. Scout sat beside him. Back at the cabin, the $18 million offer remained on the table. Jack had thought the question was whether he should risk $18 million to defend land potentially worth $265 million. But Silas had left one more message where only someone determined enough to return would find it. And before Jack could decide what the land was worth, he was about to learn why the old man had refused to sell it at all. Jack carried the envelope and field notebook back to the cabin beneath a sky filling with snow. Scout stayed close. The dog seemed satisfied now, as though whatever had been bothering him beneath the ridge had finally been brought home. Inside, Jack added another log to the stove. Blackstone's $18 million offer still waited on the kitchen table. He placed Silas's envelope beside it. For several seconds, he simply looked at the two pieces of paper. One represented enough money to make every practical problem in his life disappear. The other had been hidden behind a timber brace underground. Jack opened Silas's letter first. The handwriting was smaller than the notes in the survey ledgers, less steady. Jack, if you've reached this point, then you found Parcel 7. If you found Parcel 7, you've probably found the rest. And if Blackstone still wants this ground, they'll have told you what it's worth. Jack stopped. Scout rested his chin on Jack's knee. He continued, before you decide, understand what you're selling. Not how much. What? Jack opened the black notebook. The first pages contained dates going back nearly 30 years. Creek measurements, snowpack depths, wildlife observations. Photographs had been taped between pages. Elk moving through a narrow mountain pass. Mule deer crossing a frozen drainage. A black bear beside a stand of aspens. Then the notes changed. Industrial proposals. Test wells. Road surveys. Letters from energy and mining companies. One company name appeared repeatedly in older entries before eventually being absorbed through mergers into Blackstone Mineral and Land. Silas had tracked them for decades. Jack turned another page. A hand-drawn watershed map filled both sides. Two high mountain tributaries began inside the disputed Mercer Tract. They joined below the ridge, then fed a larger creek winding toward ranches, wells, and a small reservoir farther down the valley. Jack had crossed that creek dozens of times. He'd filled Scout's water bowl from it. Silas had written beside the map, "What happens up here does not stay up here." Jack sat straighter. The next section contained copies of environmental assessments from older development proposals. Silas had underlined concerns about erosion, heavy vehicle access, groundwater disturbance, and contamination risk. Nothing claimed disaster was certain. That wasn't Silas's style. Instead, page after page documented risk, measured, patient, specific. Jack understood now why the old man had kept everything. Silas hadn't been collecting proof of wealth. He'd been building a defensive position, not with weapons, with records. Jack continued reading. A proposed industrial road would have crossed the migration corridor Rachel had mapped. Another proposal required control of the northern access route. Several projects depended on water and subsurface rights Silas refused to surrender. Without the Mercer Tract, the corridor remained broken. With it, Blackstone could connect holdings on both sides. Jack looked at the offer. $18 million. It no longer looked like rescue. It looked like the price of removing the last locked gate. Scout stood and walked toward the door. Jack let him outside. Snow fell steadily now. The shepherd stopped at the porch railing, nose raised into the wind. Jack followed with Silas's notebook still in his hand. Across the clearing, the mountains had almost disappeared behind white. For years, Jack had believed protecting ground meant holding a position until someone told you to leave it. He remembered Afghanistan. Roads cut through dry valleys. Culverts inspected before convoys moved. Bridges repaired under miserable heat because people needed to cross them after his unit was gone. He remembered Sergeant Luis Ortega standing beside a damaged irrigation channel after a blast had torn through part of a village road. The mission had been route clearance. Luis had stayed another hour, helping local men redirect water before it flooded their fields. Jack had complained. Luis had laughed. Doesn't matter if you clear the road if everybody downstream pays for it. Luis never made it home from that deployment. A pressure plate found the vehicle behind Jack's 3 weeks later. For years, Jack had replayed the sound, not the explosion itself, the silence afterward, the impossible absence of a voice that had been there seconds before. Jack gripped the porch railing. Scout turned. The dog walked back and leaned against his leg. "I'm here." Jack wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Scout or himself. He returned inside. There were 20 pages left. Silas's writing became shakier near the end. One entry mentioned Jack by name. Saw Jack at his father's funeral today. He stayed outside when the room got crowded. Watched every car that entered the lot. Afghanistan followed him home. Jack stopped reading. He remembered that day. His father's church packed with relatives. Perfume. Flowers. People touching his shoulders without warning. A tray dropping in the fellowship hall, and Jack spinning so quickly he'd knocked over a chair. Then Silas had appeared outside. The old man hadn't asked whether Jack was okay, hadn't told him to relax. He'd simply stood 6 feet away and watched the parking lot with him. After 10 minutes, Silas had said, "Quiet's easier when nobody makes you explain why you need it." Jack had forgotten that. Silas hadn't. He turned the page. "I don't know if Jack will ever want this place. Maybe he won't. But I know what kind of work he did. Engineers aren't only taught how to break obstacles. The good ones learn what has to remain standing." Another entry came years later. Grant sees property as money. Dana sees it as inventory. Jack used to see terrain as responsibility. I hope some part of him still does. Jack's throat tightened. The final page contained only a few lines. "You already know the difference between taking ground and protecting it. If this land becomes valuable, people will tell you value gives you permission to use it. It doesn't. Value gives you choices. Character decides which one you make." Jack closed the notebook. The cabin became very quiet. He had expected instructions, a hidden clause, perhaps some final legal weapon that would destroy Blackstone's claim. Silas had left none. He had left Jack something harder. A decision. Jack picked up the $18 million offer. He imagined signing. He and Scout could leave tomorrow. A house somewhere warm. A fenced yard. A new truck. No more court. No more threats. No more wondering whether headlights coming up the mountain belonged to someone willing to hurt his dog. His fingers tightened around the pages. Scout watched him. Jack looked at the scar beneath the shepherd's coat. "You're not much help." Scout tilted his head. Jack laughed quietly. It surprised him. The sound felt strange in the cabin. Then he tore the unsigned offer in half. Once. Again. He dropped the pieces onto the table. The fear didn't disappear. Neither did the exhaustion. He still didn't know whether the deeds would survive court. He didn't know how long Blackstone would fight. He didn't know whether $265 million would someday become real money or remain only a valuation in a report. But those questions suddenly felt secondary. Jack called Evelyn. She answered on the third ring. "Please tell me you didn't sign anything." "I didn't." A pause. "All right. I'm rejecting Blackstone." "Jack, before you make that final, I'm not selling the corridor." Evelyn went quiet. "Why?" Jack looked toward the dark window. Because Silas wasn't protecting a fortune. He opened the notebook again. He was protecting everything downhill from it. The next morning, Rachel arrived before sunrise. Jack showed her the watershed maps. She spent nearly an hour comparing them with modern mapping on her tablet. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "Silas was right about the corridor." "How bad?" "I'm not saying development automatically destroys it, But this tract controls a lot more than access. Headwaters, wildlife movement, slopes that would be difficult to disturb without consequences. So we prove the title. Then, Jack looked outside. Scout was moving through fresh snow, nose down, following rabbit tracks around the woodpile. I don't know yet. Rachel waited. Jack rubbed the edge of Silas's notebook. But I'm done asking what somebody will pay me to leave. By afternoon, Evelyn had assembled the legal team. The original deeds would be authenticated. Rachel's monument surveys would be filed. Historical tax records would be matched against archived descriptions. Blackstone's communications with Grant and Dana would be requested through the legal process. No miracle. No single piece of paper that fixed everything. Just evidence, layer upon layer. Exactly the way Silas had built his case. That evening, Jack mounted the old P7 marker temporarily above his workbench. Scout settled beneath it. Snow tapped softly against the windows. A month earlier, Jack had arrived at the cabin believing he had inherited 60 worthless acres because he had nowhere else to go. Then he thought he'd discovered 8,700 acres. Then a fortune. Now he understood Silas had left him something far more dangerous than money. A reason to stay. Jack turned off the workshop light. Scout rose and followed him toward the cabin. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't thinking about where he could run if everything went wrong. He was thinking about what it would take to hold his ground. The fight lasted 11 months. There was no single courtroom moment when one forgotten deed was raised into the air and everyone suddenly understood the truth. Silas had been too careful for that. So was Evelyn. They built the case the same way Jack had once reinforced damaged roads in Afghanistan, one section at a time, testing every weak point before placing weight on it. The 1948 deed was authenticated. Then the plats. Rachel's team located 7 surviving boundary monuments, whose positions closely matched Silas's records. Archived tax documents showed payments tied to parcels that had later vanished from consolidated maps. Old photographs matched terrain features still visible on the ridge. Water filings supported separate Mercer interests along the tributaries. County archives revealed inconsistencies in later property descriptions. Then Blackstone's own records began appearing through discovery. That changed everything. The company had studied the disputed corridor years before Silas died. Internal maps marked the Mercer parcels as unresolved interests. One report described the northern access route as strategically necessary. Another warned that acquisition could become substantially more expensive if the historical Mercer chain were successfully re-established. Jack read that sentence twice. They knew. Evelyn nodded. They knew there was a title problem, and Hale offered me $450,000 anyway. He offered you $450,000 before you understood what you owned. Grant eventually cooperated. Not because his conscience suddenly became clean, because his attorney explained what the Blackstone emails made him look like. He admitted Hale had promised him and Dana a commission if Jack could be persuaded to transfer the property quietly. Dana provided messages, meeting dates, draft agreements. The visitor pass Jack had taken from Grant's truck became one small piece among dozens. Jack felt no satisfaction watching his brother's story collapse. Mostly, he felt tired. Grant called once afterward. Jack let it ring. Scout looked up from beside the stove. Jack turned the phone face down. Some relationships didn't need dramatic endings. Sometimes the ending was simply refusing to reopen the door. The final hearing came in early spring. Jack wore the only suit he owned. Scout couldn't enter the courtroom, so Sheriff Brooks volunteered to wait with him outside. He's probably smarter than half the people in there, Brooks said. Half? The sheriff smiled, trying to be polite. Jack crouched beside Scout. The shepherd's muzzle had already begun showing the first few pale hairs. Guard the sheriff, Scout licked his chin. Jack stood. Inside, the hearing lasted most of the day. Experts testified. Maps were projected. Documents were compared. Attorneys argued over recording defects, historical descriptions, notice, taxes, easements, and competing interpretations of the chain of title. Jack understood only part of the legal language, but he understood terrain. And every time Rachel placed an old Silas bearing beside a modern survey point, the land seemed to speak for itself. By late afternoon, the ruling came. The court confirmed Jack's controlling interests across the disputed Mercer holdings, subject to several limited pre-existing easements and regulatory restrictions. The old records had not magically erased every modern claim, but they had proven enough. More than enough. Blackstone did not get the corridor it had expected to acquire cheaply. Its dealings surrounding the attempted purchase were referred for further review, matters Jack left to lawyers and authorities. Outside the courthouse, Evelyn hugged him. Rachel shook his hand, then ignored the handshake and hugged him too. Jack stood awkwardly through both. Then the doors opened. Scout came running. Jack dropped to one knee. The dog hit him hard enough to nearly knock him backward. For the first time all day, Jack smiled. "Yeah," he whispered into Scout's fur. "We can go home." The $265 million estimate appeared in newspapers afterward. Reporters called, investment firms called, developers called. People Jack hadn't heard from in 15 years suddenly remembered his number. Jack changed it. He didn't sell the whole tract. That surprised nearly everyone. Working with conservation specialists, attorneys, neighboring ranchers, and financial advisors, he placed the most sensitive headwaters and wildlife corridor under permanent protections, while preserving limited uses that could support the property without destroying what Silas had defended. Selected leases generated more money than Jack needed. The cabin remained the cabin. He repaired the roof, upgraded the solar system, installed a better water system, bought a dependable used truck. Nothing about it looked like the home of a man associated with a 9-figure property valuation. That was deliberate. 2 years later, an old equipment shed below the cabin became the first workshop for the Mercer Ridge Veterans Program. Jack hated the original name someone suggested. Healing Heroes Retreat. No. The coordinator blinked. No, we're not exhibits. So they built something simpler. A place where former service members could learn carpentry, equipment repair, trail maintenance, forestry work, and basic construction. Nobody was required to explain what happened overseas. Nobody was asked to give inspirational speeches. If a man needed to work alone, there was fence to repair. If a woman couldn't stand in closed rooms, there were miles of trail. If someone woke at 3 a.m, the workshop light was usually on. Jack understood that part. He still woke too. The first year, he sometimes found himself outside before realizing he'd left the bed. Scout always found him. Years passed. The scar on Scout's shoulder disappeared beneath thick fur, but Jack knew exactly where it was. The old barbed wire injury left a slight stiffness in the dog's rear leg during cold weather. Scout became slower, then gray. Jack became gray with him. One January evening, snow fell hard across the Wind River country. Jack sat on the porch beneath a wool blanket. Scout lying beside his chair. The valley below had vanished beneath white. Lights glowed from the workshop farther downhill. Someone was laughing near the equipment barn. A hammer struck wood. Ordinary sounds. Useful sounds. Then a sharp crack rolled across the mountains. Jack's shoulders locked. His hand tightened around the chair. For half a second, a different landscape pressed against the edges of his vision. Heat. Dust. A road. Luis. Jack's breathing stopped. Scout raised his head. The old shepherd didn't jump up anymore. He simply placed his muzzle on Jack's knee. Jack looked down. Silver fur surrounded Scout's eyes. Yeah. He put one hand on the dog's head. The sound had been a tree breaking beneath snow. Nothing more. Jack stayed where he was. He didn't hit the ground, didn't check the windows, didn't scan for contact. He waited until his shoulders loosened. Then he watched the snow again. The memories had never disappeared. That wasn't how it worked. Some nights were still bad. Crowded rooms could still become too small. Unexpected noises could still move his body before his mind caught up. There were names he still couldn't say without seeing faces. But the memories no longer made every decision for him. Above the cabin door hung a corroded brass disc. Mercer, P7, 1948. Visitors sometimes asked why Jack displayed that ugly old marker instead of newspaper clippings about the $265 million land valuation. He usually shrugged. The money had never been the important part. One winter morning, years earlier, Scout had crossed hidden barbed wire and bled into the snow because something beneath the ground had caught his attention. That marker had opened the first door. Everything afterward, the deeds, Blackstone, the court battle, Silas's notebook, the protected watershed, the workshop below the ridge, had grown from that moment. Jack looked at Scout. The old dog's eyes were half closed. "You know," Jack said, "you were supposed to be the easy part of my life." Scout's tail struck the porch once. Jack laughed. Below them, the creek continued beneath ice toward ranches and homes farther down the valley. Elk tracks crossed the protected ridge. Snow covered the underground shelter where Silas had hidden his evidence. The mountain looked much as it had before anyone argued over what it was worth. Jack liked that. He had once believed surviving meant staying mobile. Keep your pack light. Know your exits. Never depend on ground you might have to abandon. Silas had left him a different lesson. Some ground was worth staying for. Not because somebody offered millions for it, because protecting it gave you a reason to wake up tomorrow. Jack pulled the blanket farther over Scout's back. The dog sighed and leaned against his boot. Years earlier, a homeless veteran had arrived here with almost nothing, expecting a worthless cabin and 60 forgotten acres. His German shepherd had found a survey marker, then a hidden deed, then 8,700 acres tied to a fortune that could have changed Jack's life overnight. But Scout's greatest discovery had never been worth $265 million. He had led Jack to a place where running finally stopped making sense. A place with work still to do, people worth helping, water worth protecting, memories he could carry without letting them choose every road, and an old dog who had spent his entire life refusing to leave him behind. Snow gathered along the porch railing. Jack rested his hand on Scout's head. Neither moved. For once, there was nowhere else they needed to be, and maybe that was the real treasure Scout had found. Not the land, not the deed, and not the millions, but a place where a man who had spent years surviving could finally choose to stay. If Jack and Scout's story meant something to you, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe loyalty can lead us home when we've lost our way, leave a 0. And subscribe to the channel, because another unforgettable story is waiting just beyond the next ridge. We'll see you there.